Welcome back to Dungeon Brew, everyone. We are going to be finishing up our government series with oligarchies today. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Hey everyone, we're going to be talking about oligarchies today on Dungeon Brew. This is the final video in the series where we've been talking about governments and fantasy settings. Joshua, will you get us started with a definition of oligarchy for those who are not familiar with it?
Yeah, oligarchies in its most basic sense is a government in which the people is in the hands of specific people or types of people. This is people that have power, that are maybe privileged. This could be due to age, gerontocracy, religious states, such as like a theocracy, whatever the case may be. It comes in a variety of different ways. In my mind, I'm like, it could be in children and old people and crazy people. You just pick who you want to have in charge of your thing and send that hands of those specific people.
I'm hopefully someone will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm fairly certain that in among baboons, the children are actually in charge. If I remember right. So, it's not impossible that something like that would come up. I'm not familiar with what the Greek word for youth or children is to turn that into whatever the word would be, but that would be it.
One of the very first books I ever tried to write a society that was like that because they believed in reincarnation and children coming back into the world were most connected to their old souls to be able to have the knowledge and wisdom of their past lives. And so they were in charge of the society. But I just couldn't flesh it out enough to make it work. And so I ended up abandoning it. But I thought
there you go, people. Concept. That's probably the most interesting idea that you're going to hear today. All right, so to kick it off, we're going to be talking about aristocracies, which I think most people are familiar with the word, but the actual meaning of it is ruled by the best. And this is one of those where it gets a little bit difficult to determine what best is. Oftentimes this has to do with something like the people who are nobility or that type of thing, but why are they that way? So who is the best depends on the values of the location or the nation or the culture, and it could be considered simply the community leaders. It could be heroes, and I think eventually what occurs most often is that you're talking about the descendants of remarkable individuals is kind of where you get that noble class or that aristocratic class. There we go, that's the word. So the aristocracy tends to be, these were the best people, therefore it's the best bloodlines, therefore they're the ones who are ruling our people.
Yep, absolutely love that idea. My mind, for some reason, is playing that scene in Men in Black when they're in there taking their test. And they're like, who are you looking for? The best of the best of the best, sir. You have no idea what that means, do you? You don't even know how to identify that.
Yeah.
The next one we're going to look at is a gerontocracy. This is where power resides within the hands of the eldest individuals within a populace. This notion usually comes from the thought that wisdom comes with age and that the elderly are less likely to be rash, they're less likely to be impulsive, maybe even ambitious. They're not going to be pursuing maybe their own ends to the means. They're trying to leave the world in a better place than they found it. They're trying to give back to the generations to come. Sometimes the threshold to join this council of leaders is based on reaching a certain age, and sometimes it's limited to a specific number based on who is the oldest.
Right. So this is one that I think I use pretty often, actually. I really like the idea of gerontocracies, especially for small communities, which, we talked about quite a bit with our settlement series, but the idea of, there's a council of elders who rule the small hamlet or the small village that you come through, and there's 3 or 5 or whatever, but they're the ones who are in control of decision making. The next one is a matriarchy. So this is power residing in female members within the location. Only women are allowed to hold significant positions of authority because they're perceived in some way being superior. This would be a cultural or whatever for exactly why that is the case. But for whatever reason, they've been placed above their male counterparts. And oftentimes, matriarchies are paired with other types, something like a gerontocracy that we had just talked about. So the elder women are the ones who are in charge, the women's council of some kind, that type of thing. And the other option is that there might be some kind of separation where women rule one type of one aspect of the government or one aspect of the society, and the men rule the other in a patriarchy, which Josh is going to talk about here as well.
Yeah. One of the things that I like about matriarchies is that we can find those frequently within history, especially among like hunter-gatherer tribes or old ancient settlements of humankind, because it was thought, that women hold the power of life within them, so they have the foresight to speak about life and the nature of life and the direction of life, and they were a valued piece of the community because all the men can go to war and die, but the woman can still continue on, with a single man to bring on the rest of the tribesmen to be able to grow, where men couldn't do that on their own. So it's interesting to think how matriarchies have kind of held a token for human civilization in the past.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense that it's like there's that division of power. Women are in charge of this, men are in charge of this, and that's kind of a natural state, I think, in older governmental type situations.
Mm-hmm. So then we are going to get to patriarchies, but first we're going to talk about meritocracies. This is where power resides within the most meritorious people of the location. These are people that are essentially talented in some way, shape, or form, and so then they hold authority within society based on just being seen in that light. That merit can have a variety of different ways of perceiving it. It may be like skilled craftsmen in the city, or the most educated, or any trait that really establishes them as having a specialized achievement that separates them from maybe the larger population as a whole. It makes them to be more notable in some way, shape, or form. I've actually seen this played out in some Tolkien-esque societies in the Lord of the Rings, where there's certain, guilds or craftspeople that have a place on councils because of that notoriety. Notoriety. There we go. Yeah.
Yeah, I find some of these meritocracy and aristocracy, and then we'll talk about another one here in a minute. Those types of governments very fascinating, where it's like there's this kind of arbitrary best notion, and then that is what puts somebody in control or in power in some way, because the society or the culture has decided that some trait is important in some way, and it gives them authority. Our next one here is noocracy. So noocracy is the idea that the wisest are in charge. So again, this might be something like a gerontocracy, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the eldest. It can be younger members of the society who are in some way seen as being knowledgeable, having some secret insight into philosophies or truths, and they have this sense of knowledge that gives them authority in some way, and what the society considers to be wisdom is usually, again, subjective. The big thing here is that they're subject to things like tautologies, truisms, and catechisms, because breaking out of what is considered to be wise or what is considered to be true in this type of society can be difficult, because they accept something as being true, or they say this thing is wise, and then they repeat it, and they are not willing to hear new information because this is always true, this is always wise, this is the way it's always been.
I don't know that I have anything to add on that one. I like the idea of this, but I think it can really lead to a place of corruption too, especially if those truths or those knowledges are I don't know, opposing values, I guess, that we have today. At the point that it starts getting into the bizarro, weird realms of things, it can be really kind of a piece that can lead the society astray.
Yeah, stagnation, I think, is a big thing in a number of oligarchies. This is part of what Sparta struggled with, is that there was stagnancy where they were doing the same thing. They didn't experience growth. They didn't experience change because they got locked into this notion of this is the way that we do things, and this is the way it has always been, and this is the way it will always be. This is particularly difficult with things like gerontocracies, where it's like you're getting to the eldest, which by that point there's a lot of tradition baked very hard into it, and that's kind of the danger with noocracies as well.
Speaking of potential oligarchies that can suffer from stagnation, let's talk about the patriarchy.
This
is where power resides in the male members of a location. Only men can usually hold a significant position of authority because they're perceived in some way as being superior, or society has otherwise placed them above their female counterparts. Oftentimes, a patriarchy is coupled with a kind of gerontocracy, so that the eldest men rule as a separation so that men rule one aspect of society and women rule the other, or due to some inherent prowess that separates them away from or above women. Oftentimes, we've seen this play out in our own history where you have particular rule books or even religious ideologies that start to support this type of conceptualization of power and power being placed into men, and then it's taught throughout the society so it's more well accepted and swallowed as a whole.
Yeah. So, just the inverse or the reverse of matriarchy. It's very interesting it's like I said, it's something that we see played out in our own world way more than any matriarchy, but it's definitely one that you can play around quite a bit with to explore how it developed in that way and why it is the way that it is.
I know the answer to that. I made a podcast on it, but we don't have to get into that today. I was like, I just realized that one was underneath my thing. I was like, I'm not going to say anything offensive. I might say a few things. No, We'll let it go. All right.
So the next one is a plutocracy. And a plutocracy is where power resides in the hands of the wealthiest members of society. They hold the most authority. They determine the rule of law. And they're likely to have requirements to have the authorities, such as land-owning individuals, or that it is some kind of like sliding scale. And the wealthiest individual or family have the most autocratic power. So something along the lines of, if you are a landowning individual, you might be able to be on some kind of council of some kind, but only the wealthiest person within the nation is the one who actually holds power, almost like a monarch of some kind.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is oftentimes in my mind coupled with early medieval conceptualizations of when you had, your kings that would give land to the barons, or they would have their vassals that would manage certain areas of land and be given to them to give them wealth and titles, to kind of give them some sense of an autocratic power, but it all fueled down from a singular autocrat.
Right, and it's not really something that's changed a whole lot. That was a lot. In Greece, you had, I think Athens specifically, they had only landowning individuals were permitted to be part of their democratic style of thing. So it's like they identified themselves as being a republic, but in reality, there was the plutocratic element where you weren't considered a citizen, or you weren't considered worthy of being allowed to vote on certain issues if you didn't own land. So this type of notion is something that we see continued on even into today, where there are wealth margins that prevent certain people from having access to things in general throughout the world, whether that's access to certain rights, access to voting power, or access to other amenities of society.
All right, so let's dive into a stratocracy. This is where power resides within the military members of a location. This is going to be a lot of fun for a fantasy setting. This is where members of the military rule, usually based upon their rank within a sect. While military members are the privileged class, it is possible that the head of the military can also have autocratic authority, or that the order is ruled by a council of some kind. There's aspects of this even within the United States, that the president is the commander-in-chief that oversees, all the different military branches and how they then exercise that power in the world. But to have a governance that is specifically set up where the military is the ruling sect of that civilization is a really interesting concept.
And it's also one that, again, we saw in Sparta. Sparta is very good for oligarchic talks. It was a patriarchy. It was a... what was the other one that we just talked about a minute ago? Whatever. It's a stratocracy, but it's the idea that I think it's also a gerontocracy to some degree, because the elder members, once you retire, were the ones who were part of the council and made decisions. So... Anyway, but it's very fascinating because it actually marries a bunch of these different oligarchic elements into one thing. But the military portion of that society were the ones who were really in charge. They were the ones who had
Mm-hmm.
authority, they had power, they had ability to do things that the slave population was not allowed to do. And so it kind of separated them above and beyond the remainder of the people who were located within that land. So, theocracy is the next one, and that is power that lies within religious members. The members of the religious order, usually based on their rank within that sect, in the same way that the military one is, that they have more power potentially than others. Religious members are privileged. There's possibly a head of the religious order of some kind that might have autocratic authority, or the order is, or the religious authority is governed by a council of some kind, same way as the military one.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a whole lot to share on this one. I think that this has been a fear of many people throughout our own history of it leading in that direction. There's been some sway of power back and forth between religious institutions and the people and other governments where they've been vying for power or say over the laws or the structure around society. But this is, I think, a popular one that people use within TTRPGs because it's a fun concept to play with.
I will say that probably the best example of this is looking at the Catholic Church, probably in Italy, or in Europe in general during the early medieval period. And the authority that the Pope had, and then the various cardinals, bishops, etc. underneath him, and what they were able to do by moving around in society. They definitely had a level of authority that was not equaled for everyone else.
Mm-hmm. And then last one we want to talk about is a democracy. This is where power resides within the most honorable people in a location. Now, who's honorable depends on the values of the location, but it can be represented by specific codes of conduct within society, which might include traits such as honesty and integrity, but also could include traits of cleverness and bravery. When I think of democracies, which I don't know that I have a really good example in our world, but if you wanted to put it within a fantasy setting, maybe you have a council of knights that are ruling over a particular area, or paladins, or folks that have essentially reached a certain status and uphold those values that the rest of society looks up toward.
The other good example I can think of is within the Norse sagas, the Fernalda sagas. There's very much a notion of honor, and it isn't necessarily the person who is in charge, but honor is one of the most respected traits. It's their moral or ethical principle for the governing of that society in a number of ways. And it's interesting because there's definitely that strength and bravado, that masculinity that comes into it, but there's also that if you are super clever in the sagas, then you are somehow seen as being superior, and cleverness is always something that is looked well upon as being an honorable trait.
Mm-hmm. So that is our full list here of oligarchies that we're going to cover. There are, of course, other ones you can go look into. Go watch the movie Idiocracy. That's a good example of a whole different side of things, but it's the same conceptualization. But anything else that you want to add with these, John? I know that we've kind of kept them longer with this particular video.
The big thing with this is that, and we talked about this in the first video, and I want to reiterate it here, is that we aren't necessarily talking about every single type of government. We're trying to provide some brief ideas of what some of these governments are to help spark interest and inspirations for your own creations, your own world, your own campaign. And then the other thing is that even though we're providing some definitions here, that doesn't mean that you can't mix and match here. You can definitely take a noocracy and combine it with different types of democracies or autocracies. I mentioned a couple of times, even in this video, that a place like Sparta was actually mixing and matching oligarchies within their own society. Only men had power. Only men who were in the military had power. Only men of a certain age actually were able to get onto the council. There were all of these stepping stones that allowed you access to greater ability and greater power within that society. You can do the same thing here, where maybe there's an election type thing, like we talked about with Greece, where you have a kind of republic. There were people who could make decisions and have votes, but there are limitations. Only men could do it. Only landowning men can do it. Only women can do it. Play around with the ideas, mix and match, get something very creative and unique for your own society or your own world when you're going through and building things.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I know as we were finishing up this video, I was thinking, man, that democracy would work really well almost with an anarchy. I recognize it's an area of governance, but it upholds certain ideals that could be anarchic and whatever, that brings together a council just to make particular decisions whenever needed that uphold those values. Like I said, there's a lot of mixing and matching pieces here that could work for your fantasy setting and the different races or cultures that you create.
Yeah. All right, so if you guys have any thoughts regarding governments, or if there's anything else that you think we should have covered that we did not, please leave that down in the comments below so that we might be able to revisit this series at some point. If you have not already, please like and subscribe to support the channel, and we will see you in the next series.
Judge and Brew.